Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more of the last chapter for Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. Yeah, we're almost finished with the book. Probably this episode and one more should finish it out. But anyway, let's get into this. It hurts though. It hurts like hell. Even in the knowledge that our punctuation has arrived at its present state by a series of accidents, even in the knowledge that there are at least 17 rules for the comma, some of which are beyond explanation by top grammarians, it is a matter for despair to see punctuation chucked out as worthless by people who don't know the difference between whose and whose bloody automatic grammar checker can't tell the difference either. And despite the and despair was the initial impetus for this book. I saw a sign that said books with an apostrophe in it, and something deep inside me snapped. Snapped with that melancholy sound that you hear in Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, like a far-off cable breaking in a mine shaft. I know that language moves on. It has to. Not once have I ever stopped to feel sorry for those Egyptian hieroglyph artists tossed on the scrap heap during a former linguistic transition. Birds' heads in profile, mate. You having a laugh, but I can't help feeling that our punctuation system, which has served the written word with grace and ingenuity for centuries, must not be allowed to disappear without a fight. Nothing as scary as this has confronted punctuation before. True, Gertrude Stein banged on a bit, but attacks on punctuation that have always been feeble. The futurists of the 20th century had a go, and without much lasting effect. In 1913, F.T. Marinetti wrote a manifesto he called Destruction of Syntax, Imagination Without Strings, Words in Freedom, which demanded the moral right of words to have unfettered. The only slightly undermined its case by requiring such a lot of punctuation in the title. By the imagination without strings, wrote Marinetti, I mean the absolute freedom of images or analogies, or expressed with unhampered words and with no connecting strings of syntax and no punctuation. Marinetti wanted to explode in the so-called typographical harmony of the page, and he was influential both on poetry and on graphic design. Reading him now, however, one's main impression is of a rather weedy visionary who fell asleep one night, saw in a dream how to use Quark Express, and was then cruelly deposited back again in the days before the First World War. On the same page, therefore, we will always use 3 or 4 colors of ink, or even 20 different typefaces if necessary. For example, italics for a series of swift sensations, boldface for violent onomatopoeias, and so on. With this typographical revolution and this multicolored variety in the letters, I mean to redouble the expressive force of words. So much for Marinetti, then. Meanwhile, George Bernard Shaw, along with his famous doomed campaign to reform the spelling of the English language, has already started asking efforts to undermine the contractive apostrophe. And while he certainly had more global influence than Marinetti did, he remained a one-man campaign. It is a measure of Shaw's considerable monomania, by the way, that in 1945 he wrote to the Times on the issue of the recently deployed atomic bomb to point out that since the second B in the word bomb was needless, I'm not joking, enormous numbers of working hours are being lost to the world through the practice of conforming to traditional spelling. I can scribble the words bomb barely legible 18 times in 1 minute and bomb 24 times, saving 25% per minute by dropping the superfluous B. In the British Commonwealth, on which the sun never sets, and in the United States and North America, there are always millions of people continually writing. Those who are writing and are losing time at the rate of 131,400 x per annum. Abraham Tauber on George Bernard Shaw on Language, 1965. Yes, GBS can be a pretty stark reminder of how far one may lose one's sense of proportion when obsessed by matters of language. But on the other hand, he still writes better about language than most people, and in the author in April of 1902, he set out his notes on the Clarendon Press rules for compositors and readers, which included not only a brilliant attack on those uncouth bacilli apostrophes, which appear so unnecessarily in words such as don't and shan't, but was rather wonderful on italics too, and is perhaps where the Guardian got its ideas from. Not only should titles not be printed in italic, but the customary ugly and unnecessary inverted commas should be abolished. Let me give a specimen. 1. I was reading The Merchant of Venice. 2. I was reading The Merchant of Venice. 3. I was reading The Merchant of Venice. The man who cannot see that number 1 is the best looking, as well as the sufficient and sensible form, should print or write nothing but advertisements for lost dogs or ironmongers' catalogs. Literature is not for him to meddle with. Note the way Shaw, or his editor, puts the full stop inside the inverted commas in example 2, by the way. While individual obsessives seem to have made little impact on the development of punctuation in the 20th century, Shaw had few followers and nobody remembers the futurists. It is quite clear that punctuation did develop quite robustly under other kinds of cultural pressure. Hyphenation practice has changed hugely in the past 100 years. Also, capitalization. and the presentation of all forms of address. Nowadays, we write Andrew Franklin, Profile Books, 58A Hatton Garden, London, ECRN 8LX. Or let's face it, I write that because he's my publisher. But my point is, there is no punctuation in this at all, whereas just 20 years ago, I would have written Mr. A. Franklin, Esquire, Profile Books Limited, 58A Hatton Garden, London, ECI. Those of us who were taught to place full stops after abbreviations have simply adopted to a world in which they are not required. I don't write pub or bus, but I'm quite sure I used to. When I trained as a journalist 25 years ago, the intermediate rule on writers of address was that the contraction of the title still ended with the middle final letters. Thus, Mr. or Mr. or Father or Fathers, no full stop was required, whereas the title was cut short, Prof for Professor and M for Monsieur. A full stop was essential. I doubt anyone bothers with that distinction anymore. It is worth pointing out, though, that the American usage has retained a lot of the formal niceties that we have dropped. They also often use the colon after Dear Andrew, while on this side of the Atlantic we dither on whether even a comma looks a bit fussy. There are other large changes to punctuation practice in our own lifestyles that have not troubled it as much. Nobody says you can find it in the BBC, full stop, company, full stop, UK, do they? Even in the most hidebound, the most hidebound of us don't mind the word dot getting into the language. Above all, though, a revolution in typographical spacing occurred so quietly that very few people noticed. Spaces were closed up, other spaces were open, nobody campaigned. Dashes, which were once the differing lengths for different occasions, are now generally shorter, of uniform length, and sit between spaces. Until very recently, typists were taught to leave a 2 or even 3 space gap after a full stop. But now word processing programs will automatically reduce the gap to a single word space. Semicolons and colons used to have a word space preceding them and 2 spaces after, and to be honest, it looked very elegant, but nobody does that anymore. My point is that while massive change from the printed word to the bloody electric signal is inevitably upon us, we die-hard punctuation lovers are perhaps just not as frigid as we think we are, and we must guard against overreacting. Those who identify NetSpeak with 1984's Newspeak on the basis that the non-case sensitive compound words such as thought crime and double plus good bear a superficial resemblance to chat room and news group should urgently reconsider this association, not least because the key virtues of the internet are that it is not controlled by anyone, cannot be used as an instrument of oppression, and endlessly inclusive. Its embracing of multitudes even extends to chat rooms in which, believe it or not, are discussed matters of punctuation. A site called Half Bakery, for names such as Gizmo and Cheese-like Substance, to swap ideas about punctuation reform. This is where the intriguing idea of using a tilde to sort out tricky plurals such as bananas came from. In one rather thrilling exchange in 2001, moreover, a member of the Half Bakery crowd proposed the use of the upside-down question mark as a marker for the rhetorical question. This suggestion hung there like a bat in a cave for 18 months until astonishingly someone called Drifting Snowflake wrote in to explain that a rhetorical question mark, a reversed one, already exists, invented in the 16th century, though only in use for about 30 years. Gosh, I wonder if Drifting Snowflake is male and unmarried, as the internet is dedicated to proving you really have no idea who anybody is out there. What to call the language generated by this new form of communication? NetSpeak? Weblish? Whatever you call it, linguists are generally excited by it. Naomi Barron has called NetSpeak an emerging language centaur, a part speech, part writing, and David Crystal says computer-mediated language is a genuine third medium. But I don't know. Remember that thing Truman Capote said years ago about Jack Kerouac? That's not writing, it's typing. I keep thinking that what we do now with this medium of instant delivery isn't writing, and doesn't even qualify as typing either. It's just sending. What did you do today? Send a lot of stuff. Don't forget to send, dear. Receiving, sending, and arithmetic. You could say goodbye to the 3 R's clearly, where valuable office hours are used to be lost and the people schmoozing at the water cooler. They are now sacrificed to people publishing secondhand jokes to every person in their email address book. We send pictures, videos, web addresses, homilies, petitions, and of course hoax virus alerts, which we later have to apologize for. The medium and the message have never been so strongly identified. As for our writing personally to each other, how often do you hear people complain that emails subtract the tone of voice? That it's hard to tell if someone is joking or not. Clicking on send has its limitations as a system of subtle communication, which is why, of course, people use so many dashes and italics and capitals. I am joking. To compensate. That's why they came up with the emoticon too. The emoticon being the greatest or most desperate, depending on how you look at it, advance in punctuation since the question mark in the reign of Charlemagne. You will know all about emoticons. Emoticons use this proper name for smileys, and a smiley is famously this. forgetting the idea of selecting the right words in the order and channeling the reader's attention by means of artful pointing. Just add the right emotion to your email and everybody will know what self-expressive effect you thought you kind of had in mind. Anyone interested in the punctuation has a dual reason to feel aggrieved about smileys, because not only are they a paltry substitute for expressing oneself properly, they are also designed by people who evidently thought the punctuation marks on the standard keyboard cried out for an ornamental function. What's this dot on top of a dot thing for? What earthly good is it? Well, if you look at it sideways, it could be a pair of eyes. What's this curvy thing for? It's a mouth. Look, hey, I think we're onto something. Now it's sad. It looks like it's winking. It looks like it's sticking its tongue out. The permutations may be endless. Mixed up, dunce, pouting, surprise. Well, that's enough. I've just spotted a third reason to loathe emoticons, which is when they pass from fashion, and I hope they already have. Future generations will associate punctuation marks with an outmoded and rather primitive graphic pastime and despise them all the more. Why do they still have all these keys with things like dots and spots and eyes and mouths and things? They will grumble. Nobody does smileys anymore. But yeah, that ends that part. Let's go back and look at some of the stuff in here and break it down a little further. Yeah, they talk about the difference between whose, and of course one has comma and one is the WHOSE. Talking about they saw a sign for books, BOOKS, but it had an apostrophe in it, which means that is indicating the book owns something, not plural. But yeah, I thought it was funny when she was talking about Egyptian hieroglyph artists tossed on the scrap heap for what they used to do. Talking about F.T. Marinetti's manifesto, Destruction of Syntax, Imagination Without Strings, Words and Freedom. They have the slash marks in it, so it's Destruction of Syntax / Imagination Without Strings / Words and Freedom. So yeah, let's see. And then I thought it funny about the use of different colors ink to express certain punctuation. Talks about George Bernard Shaw wanting the last B in bomb dropped from the way it's spelled. Talking about the Guardian not liking italics and just wanting it to be the Merchant of Venice straight out. no italics, no quotations, no, yeah. Whereas they show the other versions, The Merchant of Venice, with the quotation marks around it, or The Merchant of Venice in italics. Talks about using punctuation in writing, which I remember being taught in school. I was in school at the era when they were still showing punctuation in writing. When you did put 2 spaces behind the period for the next sentence. Yeah. But yeah, the punctuation in writing to whom a letter is addressed. So yeah. And talking about the use of other punctuation like periods and commas for abbreviated forms of words. Mr., Father, Professor, Monsieur. Then she talks about NetSpeak. And then, of course, finally she gets into the whole punctuation on keyboard being used to create faces. Colon, dash, closing parenthesis. And that would make like a smiley face. And of course, there's others. If you use the opening parenthesis instead, that makes a frowny face. Put a semicolon instead of just a colon, and it makes it look like somebody's winking. Or a small R, it looks like somebody's mouth with the tongue stuck out. And then they show others mixed up, dunce, pouting, surprise. So yeah. But yeah, I look at the different ways in which punctuation, even today, is still changing, and how we express ourselves with, whether it's type, keyboard, or writing, pencil, pen, what have you. But yeah, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing. Ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.